Captain Randolph Marcy stood in the middle of what used to be a supply train, and the smell told him everything he needed to know before he even started counting bodies. It was May 1849, somewhere in the Texas prairie between Fort Smith and Santa Fe, and 23 men had died trying to protect $40,000 worth of flour, medical supplies, and ammunition that now burned or scattered across 2 miles of grassland. The wagons had been pulled into a loose line, which meant the teamsters had tried to fight, but a line was just a shooting gallery when you were facing mounted warriors who could circle you like water flowing around a rock. Marcy had seen this before. He'd see it again. Unless something changed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mathematics of the disaster were actually worse than the firsting, human cost, and Marcy knew this even as he helped wrap bodies in canvas. $40,000 represented about 6 months of supplies for 3 frontier outposts. Those medicines could have treated cholera, which was tearing through settlements that summer. That ammunition would have armed 2 companies of dragoons for patrol duty. And the flour. Well, flour was life on the frontier. The difference between a settlement that lasted through winter and one that turned into a collection of graves by spring. But here's what really kept Marcy awake as he made camp that night near the ruins. This wasn't unusual. This was the 4th destroyed supply train he'd investigated in 2 months. Insurance companies back east had stopped covering shipments beyond Fort Leavenworth, which sat about 500 miles from where he was standing. They'd done the accounting and realized they were losing money on every policy. The underwriters had a name for the frontier. They called it the Red Zone, and they weren't being poetic. They meant it showed up as red ink in their ledgers. 40% of all supplies shipped west simply disappeared. 40%. Not damaged, not delayed, gone. Either burned like this train or scattered across the prairie or, if the attackers had use for it, packed onto horses and vanished into territory so vast you could hide entire armies in the empty spaces. $2 million a year. That was the estimate, and it was probably conservative. $2 million vanishing into grass and sky and violence. For context, the entire United States military budget in 1849 was about $9 million. We were losing almost a quarter of our total military spending just trying to move supplies from one place to another. Think about that. Not fighting wars, not building forts, just trying to get flour and bullets from Missouri to New Mexico without having everything stolen or destroyed. Marcy understood something that a lot of officers didn't, though. This wasn't just about Native American raids, as if that phrase explained everything and excused anything. The warriors attacking supply trains were defending their territory using absolutely rational tactics. If someone was shipping weapons and supplies to build permanent settlements on your land, you'd try to stop those supplies too. The Comanche, the Kiowa, the Apache, these weren't mindless raiders. They were conducting strategic warfare, and they were good at it. Really good at it. They'd been perfecting mobile warfare on the plains for generations, while European armies were still marching in formation and firing volleys. A Comanche warrior could shoot 20 arrows in the time it took a soldier to reload once, and he could do it while riding at full gallop. The Plains tribes had developed cavalry tactics that wouldn't be matched until the 20th century. And here's where Marcy's background becomes important. He wasn't a typical frontier officer promoted through connections or lucky breaks. He'd graduated from West Point, sure, but then he'd actually studied military history the way some men studied scripture. He'd read everything he could find about Napoleon's campaigns, about Roman military treatises, about ancient warfare and modern tactics. And he'd served during the Cherokee removal in the 1830s, which was a shameful chapter in American history, but it had taught him something crucial. He'd watched Cherokee communities form defensive circles when threatened, protecting their most vulnerable in the center, while fighters took the perimeter. He'd seen it work. Ancient wisdom that predated European contact, used by societies that understood communal defense in ways that went beyond just military tactics. So that night, camped near the destroyed supply train with smoke still rising from burned wagons, Marcy started sketching in his journal. Circles, defensive positions, fields of fire. The problem wasn't that we didn't have enough soldiers. It was that we were trying to protect a moving line, and a line is the weakest defensive formation ever invented. A line has two ends, and those ends are vulnerable. A line can be flanked, surrounded, rolled up from either direction. But a circle has no weak point. Every position on a circle can support every other position. The geometry wasn't complicated, but somehow nobody was using it. The next morning, standing over a specific pile of destroyed supplies, Marcy made himself look at what had burned. Medical supplies, quinine for malaria, laudanum for pain, surgical instruments, bandages. These supplies could have saved lives in a dozen settlements where doctors were begging for resources. Instead, they were ashes, and in that moment, breathing smoke and anger, Marcy swore an oath. Not the dramatic kind you hear about in stories, but the quiet kind that actually matters. He was going to solve this. He was going to figure out how to move supplies, safely, how to protect the people doing the hardest work of expansion, the teamsters and traders and families who were taking all the risks, while generals back east argued about glory and tactics. He didn't know it yet. But that oath, made over burning medical supplies in May 1849, was about to change warfare in ways that would echo for more than a century. Because sometimes the most important innovations aren't new weapons or new technologies. Sometimes they're just ancient ideas, rediscovered and applied with mathematical precision to modern problems. And sometimes one captain, standing in the aftermath of disaster, can see a solution that changes everything. The question was whether anyone would listen to him. General William Harney had a reputation for two things: winning battles and hating new ideas. So when Captain Randolph Marcy walked into his office at Fort Leavenworth in July 1850, with sketches of wagon circles and defensive mathematics, the response was about what you'd expect. He called Marcy a theatrical fool, said the army wasn't a traveling circus, and he wasn't about to waste time teaching teamsters to drive in patterns like some kind of equestrian show. The meeting lasted maybe 10 minutes before Marcy was dismissed, and as he walked out, he heard Harney telling his aide that West Point was producing engineers instead of soldiers, and it was ruining the army. But here's the thing about being right. Eventually, the bodies pile up high enough that even stubborn generals have to pay attention. 3 more supply trains were destroyed that summer, 71 more teamsters dead, another $100,000 in supplies gone, and Marcy had friends, junior officers who believed in his ideas, traders who'd survived attacks and knew something had to change. By August, he'd gotten permission to run an experiment. Not official support, just permission. As in, you can try your circus act, Captain, and when it fails, we'll never speak of it again. The first attempt was a disaster. Marcy gathered 30 wagons outside Fort Leavenworth, hired teamsters willing to try something new, and attempted to form a defensive circle. It should have taken maybe 5 minutes. It took 45, and by the end, half the wagons were crashed into each other. 2 had broken wheels, and 1 teamster had been thrown from his seat when his mules panicked and bolted. The other teamsters were laughing or cursing or both. Marcy stood in the middle of what was supposed to be a circle and looked more like a wagon graveyard, and he understood why Harney had called him a fool. This was harder than it looked on paper. But Marcy had something going for him that a lot of officers didn't. He actually listened to the people doing the work. That night, a German immigrant named James Mueller approached him. Mueller had been a teamster for 6 years, hauled freight from Missouri to Texas and back, survived 2 attacks. He'd also served postate in the Prussian army before immigrating, and he'd seen defensive formations that looked similar to what Marcy was trying to create. European armies had used wagon forts for centuries, Mueller explained. The trick wasn't just driving in a circle, it was understanding spacing, angles, and timing. Every wagon needed to know exactly where to go, like dancers in a choreographed performance. The next person who changed everything was Caesar Johnson. Johnson was a freed slave who'd worked as a teamster since 1845, and he was one of the best drivers on the frontier. He rarely spoke in groups, but after watching the failed attempt, he pulled Marcy aside. His grandfather, Johnson said, had told him stories from Africa about defensive formations that villages used when threatened. Circles within circles, with the strongest fighters on the outside and the vulnerable in the center. His grandfather had described how every person knew their position, how the formation could expand or contract based on the threat. It wasn't just military tactics, Johnson explained. It was community survival, passed down through generations. Marcy spent the next 3 weeks talking to everyone. Teamsters who'd survived attacks described what had worked and what hadn't. Mexican traders who'd run freight in Apache territory showed him how they used their wagons as mobile fortifications. A former cavalry officer explained fields of fire and overlapping defensive positions. And slowly, piece by piece, Marcy started to understand not just what needed to happen, but how to make it happen. The mathematics were actually elegant once you worked through them. A circle 75 to 200 feet in diameter, depending on how many wagons you had. Each wagon positioned at roughly a 30-degree angle to the next, creating overlapping protection. The tongue of each wagon locked under the rear axle of the wagon ahead, creating a continuous barrier. Animals kept inside the circle, protected from stampede attempts. Gaps between wagons just wide enough for defenders to shoot through, but too narrow for horses to penetrate. It reduced your defensive perimeter by about 40% compared to a line formation, while tripling your concentrated firepower because everyone could support everyone else. But knowing the math and teaching panicked men to execute under pressure were two different things. Marcy developed a training program. 3 days, dawn to dusk. The first day was just driving in circles, over and over, until the teamsters could do it in their sleep. The second day added the 30-degree positioning, teaching drivers to judge angles by sight. The third day was the full formation under simulated attack, with riders firing blanks and shouting to create chaos. It cost $20 per wagon to modify the tongues and axles, and another $10 per teamster in wages for the training time. Harney thought that was outrageous. Marcy pointed out that replacing a destroyed wagon train cost about $1,500 per wagon, not counting the supplies or the dead men. By September 1850, Marcy had a trained group of 73 wagons ready to make the run from Fort Leavenworth to Santa Fe. The teamsters were nervous, the scouts were skeptical, and the army officers who bothered to pay attention were taking bets on how badly this would fail. Mueller was the lead driver, the one responsible for starting the circle formation. Johnson had been hired as assistant wagon master, which meant he'd help coordinate positioning, and Marcy himself rode along, officially as an observer, but really because he knew if this failed, his military career was over. They were 11 days out from Fort Leavenworth when the scouts reported a war party. About 500 warriors, mostly Comanche, moving to intercept the train. This was exactly the scenario that had destroyed dozens of supply trains. The normal response would be to run, try to outpace the attack, maybe sacrifice the rear wagons to save the front. But Marcy gave the signal, and Mueller cracked his whip 3 times in the air, the agreed-upon command. What happened next took 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Marcy timed it. 73 wagons transformed from a moving line into a defensive circle. The outer wagons swung wide while the inner ones tightened, and the whole formation rotated like a closing fist. Tongues locked under axles. Drivers jumped down with rifles. Animals were herded to the center, and then silence. Just the sound of 500 horses approaching, and 73 men checking their weapons, and Marcy standing in the center of the circle, watching the mathematics of defensive warfare become reality. The Comanche warriors saw what was happening and pulled up short. This wasn't normal. Supply trains ran or formed desperate lines. They didn't turn into fortresses. For several minutes, nothing happened. The warriors circled, at a distance, studying this strange iron turtle that had appeared on their prairie. Then someone gave an order, and they charged. The thing about a defensive circle is that it doesn't matter which direction the attack comes from, you're always ready. The Comanche hit the northwest section first, a probing attack to test the defenses. They met concentrated rifle fire from 20 different positions, all supporting each other. The warriors broke off, regrouped, tried the eastern section. Same result. They attempted to stampede the animals inside the circle, but the livestock were protected. Fire arrows were launched, but the wagons had been soaked with water during the formation. Every attack hit the same problem. There was no weak point to exploit. Chief Buffalo Hump himself was leading this war party, one of the most respected Comanche leaders of the era. After the third failed attack, he called off the assault. Later, through interpreters and trading post conversations, stories spread about what Buffalo Hump had said. He'd called the formation an iron turtle, and he'd told his warriors that the whites had finally learned to use the sacred circle, the same defensive wisdom that many native peoples had practiced for generations. It wasn't a compliment exactly, but it was recognition. The tactical advantage that had belonged to the Plains tribes for decades had just shifted. Inside the circle, men were reloading and staring at each other in disbelief. They'd held. 73 wagons against 500 warriors, and they'd held. One man had been wounded by an arrow that found a gap between wagons. 0 dead, 0 wagons lost, and $40,000 worth of supplies still intact and heading to Santa Fe. But something else was happening too. Something Marcy hadn't fully anticipated. Women were part of these wagon trains, wives of teamsters, families heading west, and during the attack, they'd grabbed rifles and joined the defense. A woman named Mary Bridger, wife of one of the lead teamsters, had fired 17 shots during the battle, loading and shooting between the spokes of a wagon wheel, like she'd been doing it her whole life. After the battle, she told Marcy that if they were going to be targets anyway, they might as well be armed targets. Within weeks, training women to shoot became part of the standard circle defense protocol. The modifications kept coming. Some teamsters started reinforcing wagon sides with extra planking, creating what they called fighting wagons. Others experimented with adding small cannons, mountain howitzers that could be positioned inside the circle and fired over the wagon walls. The circle wasn't just a formation anymore, it was becoming a mobile fortress system, adaptable and evolving based on what worked in real combat. When Marcy's train reached Santa Fe with all supplies intact, word spread fast. By October, other wagon masters were requesting training. By November, the army was paying attention. And by December, even General Harney was quietly asking for detailed reports on the circle method, though he never did apologize for calling Marcy a theatrical fool. The question now wasn't whether the circle worked. The question was how far this idea could spread, and what would happen when everyone started using it. By 1851, the wagon circle had gone from experimental tactic to standard procedure, and the transformation happened faster than anyone expected. But here's what's interesting about tactical innovations. They don't spread uniformly. Different groups adapt them in different ways, adding their own modifications based on local conditions and cultural practices. And that's exactly what happened with Marcy's Iron Turtle. It became a template that dozens of communities customized, creating variations that were sometimes more effective than the original. The Mormon pioneers heading to Utah were among the first to fully embrace the circle method, but they added something unique. They were already using circles for evening prayer gatherings, a communal practice where families would form rings to sing hymns and share testimony. So when they adopted the defensive circle, it became dual purpose. During safe travel, the evening circle was spiritual. When threatened, the same formation became military. They developed a system where children learned both prayer positions and emergency protocols in the same drills. It sounds strange to modern ears, mixing religion and warfare so explicitly, but it worked. Mormon wagon trains in 1852 and 53 had some of the lowest casualty rates on the entire frontier. Mexican traders running freight between Santa Fe and Chihuahua added their own innovations. They'd been dealing with Apache raids for generations, and they brought techniques that reflected that experience. Leather shields stretched on wooden frames, positioned in the gaps between wagons to create additional barriers. These shields could stop arrows and deflect glancing shots, adding another layer of defense. They also developed a rotating guard system, where half the defenders could sleep while the other half stayed alert, crucial for sieges that might last days. Their circles were often smaller, tighter, designed for the mountainous terrain they traveled through rather than open prairie. African-American teamsters, both freed slaves and those still working to buy their freedom, became some of the most sought-after circle formation specialists. Caesar Johnson, who'd helped Marcy refine the original design, trained dozens of other drivers. They developed night signaling systems using lanterns, a way to coordinate movements in darkness that proved invaluable during extended defenses. There's a documented case from 1853 where a predominantly black teamster group held a circle for 6 days against repeated attacks, using light signals to coordinate water distribution and ammunition, resupply between different sections of the perimeter. When they finally got reinforcements and broke the siege, military observers noted that their defensive discipline exceeded that of regular army units. The siege of Fort Defiance in 1851 became the first major test of the circle method against a sustained, organized assault. It wasn't actually a fort. That was just what the survivors called it afterward. 400 people, a mix of settlers, traders, and a small military escort, found themselves surrounded by a coalition of Navajo and Apache warriors near Canyon de Chelly. They formed a circle with 96 wagons and held for 11 days. 11 days. Think about what that means. Rationing water in summer heat, managing sanitation for 400 people in a space maybe 200 feet across, maintaining defensive readiness when everyone's exhausted and terrified. But the circle held. What made Fort Defiance remarkable wasn't just the duration. It was the adaptation. On day 3, the defenders realized they were running low on ammunition for the southern section of the circle, so they started rotating defenders, moving fresh shooters to threatened areas, while pulling back those low on ammunition to rest and, crucially, to manufacture more bullets. They had lead ingots in the supply wagons, and they set up a bullet-making operation inside the circle, melting lead over fires and casting ammunition even as the siege continued around them. By day 7, they were producing about 200 rounds per day, enough to maintain defensive fire. The other innovation at Fort Defiance was the use of mountain howitzers, small cannons that could be loaded with canister shot and fired over the wagon walls. The military escort had brought 2 of these weapons, but initially, nobody knew how to position them effectively within a circle formation. Through trial and error during the siege, they figured out that placing the howitzers on opposite sides of the circle, elevated on reinforced wagon beds, created overlapping fields of fire that could break up concentrated attacks. This became standard doctrine afterward. Any wagon train with military escort would position artillery in the circle according to what became known as the Fort Defiance configuration. The battle that really spread the legend, though, was the miracle at Ash Hollow in 1854. 28 wagons, a small train by frontier standards, got caught in an early winter storm and found themselves facing a war party estimated at over 300 warriors. The odds were terrible. Small circle, large attack force, and a blizzard that reduced visibility to maybe 50 feet. Everything suggested this would be a massacre. But the wagon master was a veteran named Thomas Fitzpatrick, who'd trained directly with Muller, and he made a decision that seemed insane. Instead of trying to run or find better ground, he formed the circle right there in the storm. The blizzard actually became an advantage. The attackers couldn't coordinate their assault properly in the whiteout conditions, and when they charged, they hit concentrated defensive fire from a circle they could barely see until they were on top of it. The snow dampened sound, so the defenders could hear horses approaching before the riders knew exactly where the wagons were. The siege lasted 36 hours, and when the storm cleared, the war party withdrew. Every single wagon survived. Fitzpatrick later said the circle formation was like a lighthouse in the storm, a fixed point that gave his defenders an advantage even in chaos. These stories spread, and they became mythology surprisingly fast. Dime novels back east started featuring wagon circle battles, usually exaggerated beyond recognition. Folk songs appeared, like Circle Up Boys, which became popular in frontier saloons and trading posts. The lyrics were simple but effective, describing the transformation from vulnerable, line to defensive fortress, in language that teamsters and settlers could remember and teach to newcomers. Traveling shows started featuring wagon circle demonstrations, with veterans performing the 4-minute drill for audiences who'd never been west of Street Louis. But while Americans were celebrating this tactical innovation, Native American leaders were studying it and developing counter-tactics. Red Cloud, the Oglala Lakota leader, was particularly systematic about this. He experimented with fire arrow barrages, trying to overwhelm the water-soaked wagons with sheer volume of flaming projectiles. He attempted buffalo stampedes, driving herds toward circled wagons to break the formation through sheer mass and panic. He even tested night attacks, reasoning that the circle's advantage diminished when defenders couldn't see to coordinate their fire. Some of these tactics worked, at least partially. Fire arrows in dry conditions could eventually find wagons that hadn't been properly soaked. Buffalo stampedes occasionally broke through if the livestock inside the circle panicked and crashed into the wagon walls. Night attacks reduced defender effectiveness, though the lantern signaling systems developed by Johnson and others helped counter this. But Red Cloud himself reportedly admitted, through interpreters at later peace negotiations, that the circle proved stronger than winter. It was a poetic way of acknowledging that the tactical balance had shifted, that what had once been a reliable victory for mobile warriors was now a difficult and costly assault. The economic transformation was dramatic. By 1855, supply loss rates had dropped from 40% to around 4%. Think about what that means. Instead of losing 4 out of every 10 wagons, we were losing 4 out of every 100. Insurance companies started offering coverage again, which reduced shipping costs and made frontier settlement economically viable for more people. 6. Frontier forts that had been on the edge of closure remained operational because they could be reliably supplied. The Army calculated that between 1850 and 1865, the circle method saved approximately $30 million in military expenditures alone, not counting civilian economic benefits. But the lasting impact wasn't just economic or military. The wagon circle changed how Americans thought about the frontier. Before Marcy's innovation, Western expansion felt precarious, a constant battle against odds that favored the defenders of the land. After the circle became standard practice, there was a sense of inevitability, a confidence that settlement would succeed because the basic logistics were now solvable. That's not a value judgment. It's an observation about historical momentum. The circle didn't make expansion morally right or wrong, but it made expansion practically achievable in ways it hadn't been before. By 1860, elderly veterans were already demonstrating circle formations at county fairs, their aged hands still remembering the precise timing of the 4-minute drill. Children who'd grown up in wagon trains were telling their own children about nights spent inside the circle, protected by mathematics and collective defense. Family heirlooms started appearing, rifles that had been fired through wagon spokes, quilts that had been sewn during long sieges, journals describing the transformation from terror to confidence that came with mastering the formation. The question nobody was asking yet was how far this idea would travel, how a tactical solution developed on the American prairie would eventually influence warfare on 3 continents and echo forward into the 20th century. The story of how an American frontier tactic ended up being used by Boer commandos in South Africa is one of those historical connections that seems almost too neat to be true. But the documentation is solid. In the 1870s and 80s, there was significant communication between American frontier veterans and Boer settlers, both groups dealing with similar problems: vast open territories, mobile opponents, and the need to protect supplies and civilians during long-distance travel. American military manuals, including the ones Marcy had written about wagon circle tactics, were translated into Dutch and circulated among Boer communities. The Boers adapted the circle to their specific circumstances. They called it the lager, and while the basic geometry remained the same, they modified it for the African veldt. Their wagons were often heavier, built for ox teams rather than mules, so they developed specialized techniques for rapid formation with slower-moving vehicles. They also integrated the Leger with their commando system, where every civilian male was trained as a potential defender. During the Boer Wars against Britain in the late 1800s, the Leger became a signature defensive tactic, frustrating British military commanders who couldn't understand how a supposedly primitive colonial force was holding off a modern army. British officers eventually studied captured Boer defensive manuals and traced the Leger concept back to American sources. There are reports of British commanders grudgingly admitting that they were being outmaneuvered by their own colonial cousins using tactics developed by another group of colonial cousins on a different continent. It's one of those historical ironies that seems almost comedic until you remember that people were dying in these battles. Australian settlers in the outback faced their own challenges with distance and isolation, and they adopted circle formations for both defence and practical camp organisation. The Australian variation tended to be more informal, less rigidly geometric, reflecting the smaller scale of most conflicts and the emphasis on protection from environmental hazards as much as human threats. But the core principle remained: form a perimeter, protect the vulnerable centre, create overlapping fields of fire. Australian drovers, moving cattle across vast distances, used modified circles as overnight camps, and the practice persisted well into the early 1900s. In Argentina, gauchos on the Pampas developed their own version when transporting goods across territories disputed with indigenous peoples. They called it the fortín móvil, the mobile fort, and they adapted it for the carts and wagons used in South American freight transport. The Argentine variation often incorporated earthworks, with defenders using shovels to create low berms around the wagon circle during extended stops, adding another layer of protection. This hybrid approach, combining American wagon tactics with traditional field fortification, proved effective enough that Argentine military manuals in the 1880s included detailed instructions on fortín móvil construction. But the most surprising evolution came in the 20th century, when motorized warfare transformed the basic concept in ways Marcy never could have imagined. During World War II, the North African campaign forced both Allied and Axis forces to deal with problems that would have been familiar to 1850s wagon masters, protecting supply columns in open terrain against mobile attacks, and they rediscovered the circle. German officers, particularly those on Rommel's staff, actually studied Marcy's original manuals as part of their research into convoy protection. There are documented references in German military archives to Amerikanische Wagenburg Taktik, American wagon fortress tactics, being analyzed for application to motorized transport. The result was the development of vehicle circles, called Igel or hedgehog formations, where trucks and armored vehicles would form defensive perimeters when ambushed or during overnight stops. The geometry was essentially identical to Marcy's wagons: circular or oval formation, vehicles positioned at angles to create overlapping fields of fire, most vulnerable elements protected in the center. British and American forces developed similar tactics independently, though American officers who knew their military history recognized the connection. There are accounts of veteran officers in North Africa joking about using Comanche-era tactics against Rommel, though most of the younger soldiers had no idea what they were talking about. The effectiveness was undeniable, though. Motorized circles reduced convoy casualties significantly, just as wagon circles had a century earlier. The principle evolved further in Afghanistan and Iraq during the early 21st century. Forward operating bases, the FOBs that became ubiquitous in modern counterinsurgency warfare, used the same geometric principles Marcy worked out in 1849: circular or polygonal perimeters, overlapping fields of fire, vulnerable assets protected in the center, rapid deployment design that can be established quickly in hostile territory. Military engineers at West Point still teach Marcy's wagon circle as a foundational concept in defensive position design, and they draw direct lines from 1849 Texas to 21st century military architecture. In the 1930s, when the last generation of actual wagon train veterans were still alive, oral history projects captured their memories. These interviews are remarkable documents, men and women in their 70s and 80s, describing events from their childhoods with vivid clarity. One veteran, Samuel Peterson, demonstrated the 4-minute drill for a researcher in 1936. He was 81 years old, and he walked through the precise movements of circle formation, his body still remembering the choreography, even though he hadn't driven a wagon in 40 years. The researcher noted that Peterson's hands shook with age, but when he mimed cracking the whip to signal formation start, the movement was sharp and certain, muscle memory preserved across decades. These veterans brought family heirlooms to the interviews: rifles that had been fired through wagon spokes during actual battles, the wood still showing scorch marks from powder burns; quilts that had been sewn during sieges, with patterns that incorporated defensive positions or commemorated specific battles. journals describing the psychology of circle defense, the strange mix of terror and confidence that came from being simultaneously trapped and protected. One woman, Martha Simmons, showed the interviewer a diary her mother had kept during an 1854 wagon journey. The entries documented the transformation from constant anxiety during line travel to a sense of security once the train adopted circle procedures. "We sleep sound now," her mother had written, "knowing the circle watches while we rest." The economic analysis done in later decades confirmed what frontier settlers had understood intuitively. Marcy's innovation accelerated American continental expansion by approximately 10 years. That's not speculation. That's calculated from supply delivery rates, settlement establishment timelines, and population movement data. 10 years faster access to California gold, 10 years earlier establishment of transcontinental communication, 10 years accelerated agricultural development in territories that became states. The ripple effects of that acceleration affected global economics, international relations, and the balance of power in ways that are still being analyzed by historians. But there's a deeper question about innovation and adaptation that the wagon circle story raises. Marcy didn't invent the defensive circle. As he himself acknowledged, indigenous peoples had been using circular defensive formations for generations, possibly centuries. What he did was systematize it, apply mathematical precision to an ancient concept, create training, protocols that could spread the technique rapidly, and document it in ways that allowed the innovation to jump contexts and cultures. He took communal wisdom and transformed it into replicable doctrine. There's something profound about that process. The best innovations often aren't entirely new ideas. They're old ideas rediscovered and refined for new contexts. The wagon circle worked in 1849 Texas, in 1899 South Africa, in 1942 North Africa, and in 21st century Afghanistan, because the geometric principles of defensive positions don't change, even when the technology does. A circle still has no weak point. Overlapping fields of fire still multiply defensive effectiveness. Protecting vulnerable assets in the center still makes tactical sense. By the time the last wagon train veterans died in the 1940s, their innovation had already evolved beyond recognition. But the core insight remained. Sometimes the solution to an impossible problem isn't a new weapon or revolutionary technology. Sometimes it's just geometry, applied with discipline and precision by people determined to protect each other. Sometimes it's the sacred circle, rediscovered and refined by a captain standing in the smoke of a destroyed supply train, swearing an oath over burning medical supplies. That oath, made in May 1849 by a man most people have never heard of, changed warfare for more than a century, and the principle he systematized continues to protect people today, translated through dozens of languages and technologies, but still recognizably the same idea. When threatened, form the circle, protect the center, and hold the line together. That's the legacy of Captain Randolph Marcy and his Iron Turtle. Not glory or fame, but a solution that worked, that spread, that evolved, and that saved countless lives by transforming vulnerability into collective strength. One captain's insight, multiplied across continents and centuries, proving that sometimes the most important innovations are the ones that help people survive long enough to build the future.